Hey everybody, this is not the video I wanted to make on The Outer Worlds. I wanted to make a full review of the game along with its DLCs as the final video for Request Month 2023 before I went and did the Q&A video. The Q&A video is still in the works, but I wanted to go ahead and prioritize getting the Outer Worlds video done since that was supposed to be the last review of Request Month 2023, and, well, here we are in the middle of April now. The problem is that The Outer Worlds is a game that utterly bewilders me. And that is for a variety of reasons, the first of which is what it did to my previous computer. So, understand that now I'm running a Ryzen 9 5900X, 64 gigs of RAM, and an RTX 3080. It is more than capable of handling this game without any problems whatsoever. And it does handle the game without any problems whatsoever. When I first started trying to mess around with this game, I was still running my i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080. And since the publisher decided to take the Epic Game Store exclusivity deal, I was initially messing around with the Windows Store version using Xbox Game Pass, and that version did not run well at all. It just had weird performance issues, and I couldn't really get a solid frame rate out of it, so eventually I just decided to wait until it finally came out on Steam. Eventually it did come out on Steam. I went ahead and picked it up along with its DLCs, and I started messing around with the game again. This time I started running into different technical problems. It was running mostly fine, although there were still some weird frame rate issues here and there, except that now it was blue screening my computer, which is, needless to say, a pretty serious problem. Eventually I ended up putting the game aside because I was concerned about the blue screening issue and continued to mess around with other stuff, and that's when the blue screening started happening with other games, and I ended up having to replace my power supply. And while I can't be 100% sure, I think what was happening there was that something about the way the Outer Worlds is coded was causing my graphics card's power usage to spike. This actually seems to be a fairly common problem these days. Something about the way certain games are coded is causing power usage on GPUs in particular to spike, and if your power supply is capable of handling that, it's not a problem. Obviously, in my particular case, I didn't have quite enough wattage on my power supply to be able to handle it properly, and it was causing blue screens. Now, I'm actually pretty lucky in this regard because the only component in my system that was actually damaged during this whole process was an SSD. Unfortunately, said SSD was just completely fried, but that's a relatively easy and cheap component to replace. The power supply, on the other hand, was not a fairly cheap or easy component to replace. I did end up replacing it with a very good power supply, which has served me quite well ever since, but it still made me very leery of messing around with the Outer Worlds on that particular system, so I ended up holding off on messing with it until I finally built the new PC. And so fast forward to when I did finally build the new PC and I decided to go ahead and give the Outer Worlds another go, and I decided to make it the final review of Request Month 2023. And I was going to go ahead and include the DLCs along with it since I already had them, and I might as well put that all in one video as opposed to doing separate videos on the DLCs. And thus I restarted the Outer Worlds for the 4th time, and I was finally making actual progress with it. The frame rate was rock solid on the max settings, there weren't any crashes or blue screens or anything like that, and I wasn't even really running into any noticeable glitches as I was wandering around doing stuff. And that's worth praising in and of itself, because Obsidian is not known for their technical prowess, and they're certainly not known for delivering finished, stable, and technically polished experiences. I mean, after all, as great as games like Knights of the Old Republic 2 and Fallout New Vegas are, they're blatantly unfinished games that are severely lacking in the polish department, and a lot of that results in some really serious glitches and crashing problems. And that reputation has persisted for a very long time, right up until they started doing crowdfunded games like Pillars of Eternity, which is pretty much rock solid in terms of technical stuff. The Outer Worlds was the first majorly published game that Obsidian has made that has turned out this way, and that's certainly impressive. And when you don't have to sift through a quagmire of technical problems, you can start focusing on what really matter in a game, which are story and gameplay. And that's usually where Obsidian excels. Despite their technical problems, despite their games being unfinished most of the time, they usually have really good writing, and usually at least acceptable to outright decent gameplay. And so I did start focusing on the story and the gameplay of the Outer Worlds. And that's where the bewilderment comes in. Because on paper, this game should be fantastic. I mean, it's Obsidian developed, it's got a heavy emphasis on writing rather than just gameplay, it's got a lot of choice and consequence built into it, it lets you build out your characters so that they're not necessarily just a combat-focused character, you can focus on things like speech skills and diplomacy, as well as sneaking around and things like that, and the quests are normally designed in a way to where you have multiple solutions to the problem which have different outcomes. Thus, on paper, this game has pretty much everything it needs to be a fantastic role-playing game. The thing is, just having all of the right elements doesn't necessarily make the game fantastic. Doesn't even necessarily make the game good. You still have to assemble it in such a way to where all of those elements click together properly and make the experience worthwhile. And that's where Obsidian has failed spectacularly with the Outer Worlds. And that is what is so bewildering to me, because it is abundantly clear that Obsidian is packed to the gills with absolute talent. People who know what they're doing, know role-playing games in and out, and have made some of the best ones over the past 2 decades. And then you get to the Outer Worlds, a game set in the far reaches of space, where you have pretty much infinite possibilities with what you can do with the game. And what they've chosen to do with that is take a retro sci-fi inspired aesthetic and put that into a game written by someone who clearly had a major axe to grind against corporatism. And you know what? On paper, that's fine too, because they can do some really interesting things with that and make you think about what they're trying to criticize. The problem is they don't really criticize corporatism as much as they just endlessly repeat the same exact joke over and over and over again, which is corporate drones are either complete morons who are completely detached from reality or they're outright villains. Isn't that funny? To whoever decided to write all of that at Obsidian Entertainment, I have the simple statement to say to you. It's not really very funny to begin with. It gets less funny the more you repeat it throughout your 30-ish hour game. It very quickly becomes tiresome, and you find yourself looking for anything that is not the constant her corporatism bad drivel. The problem is that even when you do find things that aren't just that repeated ad nauseum, they're usually just very brief asides that end up tying directly back into her corporatism bad. The end result of that is that even though they have some rather interesting aesthetics as far as the flora and fauna of the various worlds goes, and they could have done some really interesting things with them, they just focus far too much on haha corporatism bad, and you end up not really getting much of anything else. You don't feel like you're wandering around in a lived-in world. You feel like you're wandering around a bunch of video game areas that are meant to bash you over the head with corporatism bad, okay? And it certainly doesn't help that when you're wandering around the world, everything feels really static, from the way the characters are animated to the fact that they just tend to stand around not really doing anything, not really having routines of their own. When you get into conversations with someone, they'll just stand there facing you and will barely move during the entire conversation. Barely anyone in the game actually acts like you would kind of expect a real person to act, and the ones that do are almost exclusively within your party. And they're usually the ones that are the source of that reprieve I mentioned earlier. They have the best written and acted dialogue in the entire game, and they have the best quests in the entire game, which is really unfortunate because that's not really saying much. Most of the quests in the game really just feel like filler content, like they put them in there so you could get experience points and so you could have something to do beyond just going from point A to point B and fighting some pretty much brain-dead enemies in between with a combat system that never goes beyond bare functionality. In fact, it's so bare bones and easy that once you get to about level 5 or so as a character, you're pretty much unstoppable, and I got to the point where I had so much ammunition that there is no conceivable way I would ever actually run out of it. And I wasn't even going out of my way to find it, it's just everywhere, and you get more of it than you can expend when you're fighting enemies. And because the enemies are so dumb, it basically becomes a mindless shooting gallery, so combat just ends up being incredibly boring, meaning that you're not really going to care much about it and you're going to try to focus on other things. When you try to focus on the general writing, you end up with haha corporatism bad, and then occasionally something actually good from your companions. But then you start wandering around and trying to do the faction quests and interact with the worlds themselves, and you find that every single world is set up basically the exact same way. You will have two factions. One of them is going to be some sort of corporate entity. The other one is going to be a non-corporate entity. They're going to be going up against each other, and then you have to solve the conflict between them, either by siding with one or the other, or finding some sort of a compromise in the middle. And they are so ridiculously formulaic and simplistic with this that it is stupidly easy to predict every single thing that is going to happen once you land on a world and are introduced to those factions. And because that's so formulaic and predictable, you just end up not giving a shit. It's just boring to even think about, so you just go through the motions and get through it, or you just say, you know what, I'm not going to bother with that. And that's basically what ended up happening when I was going through the Outer Worlds. It starts off a bit slow but promising. It gives you some vibes that maybe it's going to be kind of like Fallout New Vegas was and actually be really interesting. And then the more you play it, the more predictable, lifeless, and soulless it becomes, to the point where you just end up not giving a shit. The problem isn't that the Outer Worlds is a bad game, because it's not a bad game. That's the problem. If it were a bad game, it would be a hell of a lot more interesting than it actually is. Instead, The Outer Worlds is just so agonizingly mediocre that it made me want to do basically anything else other than play The Outer Worlds. I just kept finding myself going into it, messing around with it for maybe a few minutes to maybe half an hour or so, and saying, why am I even bothering with this? Eventually I got to the point where the only thing keeping me trying to play through the game was the fact that I was trying to make a video on it. I was just constantly saying to myself, look, I've got to get through this thing to make a review on it. But then the more I would mess around with it, the less I would even care about making the review. I would just find myself trying to think about what I would even say in the video and coming up with kind of a blank. I would go, well, I can talk about combat, but there's just nothing to the combat. I could talk about the writing, but the vast majority of it is just constantly repeating the same tired anti-corporatism joke over and over again. Aside from a couple of the companion quests, there's not really anything that's all that interesting in the quest lines to talk about either, so there's not really much of a point in talking about the quests. And when you're just wandering around and exploring, there's not really much to find either. You're just finding a bunch of leveled loot, and that's kinda it. And whenever you wander into an area and are trying to ascertain the storyline there, you might as well just sum it up as, well, the corporation did something really stupid or really fucked up, so it's been abandoned and maybe reclaimed by wildlife or reclaimed by marauders, and now you gotta fight your way through it. Congratulations. That accounts for most of the areas in the game that aren't just settlements and quest-specific areas. And when I was thinking about all this and trying to figure out what to say, I would start recording for a moment and then just stumble over my words, say fuck it, and then just go do something else for several hours, and then come back and sit here and go, wait a minute, I should have gotten that video done. Why the fuck didn't I get this video done? Oh right, it's because The Outer Worlds is so boring it makes me want to do literally anything else. It's actually so middle of the road that it makes me legitimately angry to think about The Outer Worlds at this point, because there's nothing that is so wrong with it that I can outright condemn the game, but there's also so little of actual value in the game that there's not really any reason for you to play it over pretty much anything else out there. I just find myself coming back to the phrase, well, yeah, The Outer Worlds is certainly a video game. Out of the many video games that exist, it is certainly one of them. And there is absolutely no way in hell I should be saying that about an Obsidian Entertainment game. This is a studio founded by former Black Isle developers who worked on Fallout 2. This is the same studio, and as far as I can tell, most of the same people who made stuff like Fallout New Vegas, Knights of the Old Republic 2, Alpha Protocol, Tyranny, hell, even the stuff that hasn't done quite as well for Obsidian, stuff like Neverwinter Nights 2 or Dungeon Siege 3 at least still had some interesting things going for them. They tried to do something interesting with them, as opposed to just phoning it in like it feels like they did with the Outer Worlds. It's like the Outer Worlds was made by a completely different developer who only understood that you have to include some certain things in the game, but didn't know how to put any of them together to make it work, and they, more importantly, didn't really give much of a crap about the writing beyond, let's just make it so that capitalism and corporatism are evil, ha ha ha. The end result is a game that is just so soulless and boring that it might as well substitute for the corporatism they're supposedly trying to criticize. And you know what? Maybe that's the point. Maybe the point of the Outer Worlds is that it is the embodiment of the Spacer's Choice slogan. It's not the best choice, it's Spacer's Choice. In other words, it's the embodiment of mediocrity, such that it actually makes me angry that it wasted my time. But for an average player, it would be not bad enough to be irritating or offensive to them, but not good enough to really be all that memorable or something to keep coming back to. But frankly, I doubt they would be that meta about it, because from what I can tell, Obsidian actually seems to care about their players and actually care about making really engaging, interesting experiences. Which is why it's so bewildering and baffling and downright infuriating even that the Outer Worlds is in the state that it's in. It should not be this boring, given who made it and what they put into it. But it is, and that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. The only thing I can really hope there is that hopefully they figure shit out with the Outer Worlds too. Maybe they turn everything around with the sequel. I'm not optimistic for it at this point, but maybe they'll figure out how to make everything work with the Outer Worlds too. I guess we'll just have to wait and see on that. But as for the Outer Worlds 1, well, unfortunately, as you can tell from this video, it's not getting a proper review on my channel because I just can't force myself to play it anymore. Obviously, if a game is good, I don't have to force myself to play it. I'll go through from beginning to end. I'll probably even be looking for secrets and stuff and having a grand old time. If it's a bad game, I can still work with that because at least there's something interesting enough about it to make it bad. And I might even be able to make fun of it or something. But if it's just boring and soulless like the Outer Worlds is, I can't do anything with that. So if you were looking into this thinking that maybe it'd be a nice return to form for something kind of like Fallout New Vegas, well, do yourself a favor and just go back and play Fallout New Vegas again. You'll be a hell of a lot happier. Thank you all very much for watching, and thanks for bearing with me on this video because it has been a frustratingly long delay on getting it done. I'm still working on the Q&A video. That should be up hopefully later this week. If not later this week, then it'll be early next week, but I'm aiming for late this week. Probably Saturday, maybe Sunday. If for whatever reason I end up having to push it back, which I don't anticipate, but if I have to, then I'll go ahead and post a notice about it. So if you're interested in the Q&A, just stay tuned, and then after that, it's back to the regular schedule of just whatever I happen to be working on at any given moment. There are a few things I'm wanting to catch up on there, so stay tuned for those as well. Thank you all very much for bearing with me on delays and such. Thank you all again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.